There is a law still on the books in England. It has been there in various forms since the 12th century. It concerns swans. Specifically, it states that all unmarked mute swans in open waters belong to the crown, not to the landowner whose property borders the water, not to the person who has been feeding them for 20 years, not to anyone who might have a reasonable claim based on proximity or care or simple familiarity, to the crown, by default, by law, because they are swans. No other wild animal in England has this status. Not the red deer on the Highland estate, not the salmon in the river, not the eagles reintroduced at considerable public expense. Swans, specifically swans. And the law has never been fully repealed because the Crown has never seen fit to give it up. This is not an accident of legal history. It is the residue of something that ran very deep in European aristocratic culture for a very long time. The connection between royal families and swans was not decorative. It was not simply that swans are beautiful and powerful people like beautiful things. The relationship was older, stranger, and more functionally specific than that. It involved food and status and a carefully maintained monopoly on something that most people today would find surprising to learn was once considered one of the great delicacies of the European table. And it involves a set of stories, told across multiple cultures and multiple centuries, that kept connecting swans to royalty, to transformation, to something sacred and untouchable, in ways that reinforce the legal and social structures surrounding them. This is the story of why the most elegant bird on the water became the property of kings, and why, in one country at least, it technically still is. Number 1. The feast. What swans actually meant at the medieval table. To understand the royal swan, you have to understand the medieval feast, not as a romantic backdrop, but as a political instrument. The great feast of a medieval European court was not primarily about food, it was about demonstration. The host was communicating wealth, power, reach, and status through every element of what was served, how it was served, and what it was served in. The rarer the ingredient, the more exotic the preparation, the more clearly the feast said what it was designed to say. You are in the presence of someone who can acquire anything. In this context, the animals served at the highest tables were not chosen for flavor. They were chosen for scarcity and for what their presence implied about the host's access and authority. Peacocks were served in their feathers, reconstructed after roasting to look alive on the platter. Herons, cranes, and egrets appeared at tables where their presence would have been impossible for anyone without the land and the falconers to produce them. And swans appeared at the highest tables of all. Royal tables, coronation banquets, the feasts that marked the moments when power was most publicly displayed and most carefully observed. The practical reality of swan as food is something that food historians approach with appropriate honesty. Swan is not, by most accounts, a particularly pleasant meat. It is dark, strongly flavored, and oily in a way that reflects the bird's diet of aquatic vegetation and, in managed populations, grain. Medieval recipes for swan involve lengthy preparations designed to manage the flavor, strong spicing, elaborate sauces, cooking methods that would not be necessary for an animal that tasted good on its own terms. None of this mattered. The point was not the taste. The point was the bird. A swan on the table meant the host had swans. Having swans meant the host had the status and the legal right to keep them. And having the legal right to keep them meant proximity to the crown, because the crown controlled who could own swans and who could not. The bird was a status credential served on a platter. Number 2. Swan Upping, the ceremony that has run for 800 years. Every July, a procession of small boats moves up the River Thames from London to Abingdon. The boats carry people in traditional dress. They stop at groups of swans on the water and catch them, check them, count them, and mark the signets. Then they release them and move on. This is called Swan Upping. It has been happening in essentially this form since the 12th century. It is one of the longest continuously running ceremonial traditions in Britain, older than most of the institutions that most British people think of as ancient. It predates the current form of Parliament. It predates the King James Bible. It has been running every July through plagues and wars and revolutions and the complete transformation of the society around it, because the Crown has never stopped doing it. The original function was administrative. The Crown and two of the great medieval livery companies, the Vintners and the Dyers, held rights to swans on the Thames. Swan Upping was how those rights were tracked. Signets were marked by notching the bill to indicate ownership. Unmarked birds defaulted to the Crown. The whole process was a physical audit of a valuable living resource conducted annually to maintain the legal record. Today, the function is largely ceremonial and conservational. The swan marker, a royal appointment that still exists, leads the procession. The swans are checked for health and injury, as well as counted. The numbers are reported to the monarch. No bill notching happens anymore. The vintners mark their birds with a single nick, a practice preserved as tradition rather than administrative necessity. But the procession still goes up the river. Every July. 800 years of the same journey, the same counting, the same assertion that these birds on this water belong to someone specific, and that someone specific is keeping track. No other country has anything quite like it. And the fact that Britain does tells you something about how seriously the swan was taken, for how long, by the people at the top of the social structure. Number 3. The mythology. Why swans kept appearing in the stories that power told about itself. The legal and culinary dimensions of the royal-swan relationship were reinforced by something older and harder to quantify. A set of stories that ran across European and Norse and Celtic cultures, connecting swans to transformation, to the divine, to the boundary between the human world and something beyond it. The Swan Maiden is one of the oldest recurring figures in European folklore, a woman who can transform into a swan, or a swan that can transform into a woman, appearing in Irish mythology, in Norse sagas, in Slavic folk traditions, in Finnish epic poetry, in stories from cultures that had no direct contact with each other but arrived independently at the same image. The swan as a being that exists between worlds. The swan as something that looks like a bird but is not only a bird. The swan as an animal that carries inside it a human or divine presence that the surface does not reveal. The specific quality that makes the swan available for this kind of story is visible. It is the combination of attributes that should not, by ordinary animal logic, go together. The size and physical power of a bird that can break bones with its wings. The grace that makes it look on water, like the least violent thing imaginable. The whiteness that in European symbolic systems carried associations with purity and the sacred. The long neck that gives it a silhouette unlike any other animal. The pairing behavior, the apparent fidelity that made it look to human observers like a creature that understood love. These qualities made the swan the bird that stories reached for when they needed to talk about transformation, about hidden nature, about the thing beneath the surface that the visible world does not show you. And the people who ruled needed exactly this kind of story. Power in medieval Europe was justified through sacred association. The king was not simply the strongest man in the room. He was the divinely appointed representative of an order that transcended the human. The animals and symbols surrounding the king needed to carry this kind of weight. The eagle did it through dominance and height. The lion did it through strength and courage. The swan did it through transformation and the sacred feminine, through the mythology of hidden divinity and visible beauty, through the accumulated weight of every story that had ever placed a swan at the boundary between the human and the divine. When a king placed swans on his lake and claimed ownership of every unmarked swan in his kingdom, he was not just controlling a food source. He was associating himself with everything those birds carried in the cultural imagination. The legal claim and the mythological claim were, in the medieval mind, the same claim. Number 4. The Swan Knight. How one story became a dynasty's founding myth. Of all the stories that connected swans to nobility, one became particularly important in the political history of Europe: the legend of the Swan Knight. The core story exists in multiple versions across multiple centuries. A mysterious knight arrives by boat, drawn by a swan or accompanied by one, to champion a noblewoman or defend a territory. He wins, he marries, he establishes a line, but he carries a condition. His wife, or those around him, must never ask who he is or where he came from. The question, when it is inevitably asked, ends everything. The knight departs as mysteriously as he arrived, drawn back across the water by the swan. The story appears in French romances, in German epics, in Dutch chronicles. Wagner made it into Lohengrin, but before Wagner, before the romantic medievalism of the 19th century, the story had a specific political function that was considerably less aesthetic. The House of Cleves, a significant noble family controlling strategic territory on the Lower Rhine, traced their founding to the Swan Knight in their official genealogy. The Dukes of Cleves maintained a live swan as a heraldic emblem. They kept swans on their waters as a deliberate reference to their claimed origin. The swan was not decorative for them. It was the founding ancestor, or at least the symbol of the founding ancestor, and maintaining it was an act of dynastic memory. The Plantagenet kings of England had a connection to the Swan Knight legend that was taken seriously enough to affect real political behavior. Henry V invoked swan symbolism at significant moments. The swan appeared on royal livery badges. The connection between the English crown and the swan was not only the practical matter of food and legal monopoly. It was woven into the narrative of legitimate descent, into the story the dynasty told about where it came from and why its rule was more than simply power. A noble family with swans on its lake was a noble family making a claim. Not just about wealth, about lineage, about the kind of origin that cannot be questioned because it is sacred. Number 5. What survived, and what the swans on your local lake are actually carrying. The feast culture ended. The legal monopoly weakened, though it was never abolished. The heraldic use of swans persists in coats of arms across Europe in a form that most people who see it no longer read. Swan Upping continues on the Thames every July, watched by tourists who mostly do not know what they are watching. And the swans are still there. The mute swan population of Britain has been managed, monitored, and legally protected in ways that no other wild bird species has been for 800 years. The birds on the river at Windsor, the ones on the backs at Cambridge, the ones on the lake in St. James's Park with Buckingham Palace behind them, are the living residue of a cultural and legal investment that has been running since the 12th century. They are there because someone decided, in a world where almost nothing was preserved for its own sake, that these birds were worth keeping. Not for ecological reasons, not for the reasons we would give now, for reasons of status and symbolism and the specific political utility of an animal that looked like something between the human world and something beyond it. The reasons have changed. The protection remained. And the birds, in their complete indifference to all of it, are the same birds they were when Roman poets used them as a byword for impossibility, when Dutch sailors watched them from a riverbank on the other side of the world, when kings put them on their tables and their banners and their lakes and their founding myths. The next time you stand at the edge of a lake and watch a mute swan move across the water toward you, you are looking at an animal that has been at the center of human power, human mythology, and human legal systems for longer than most of the institutions you interact with daily have existed. It does not know this. It is looking at you with the same flat, assessing gaze it would give to anyone. But you know it now, and knowing it changes what you are looking at. Tell me in the comments, did you know that the Crown still technically owns unmarked swans in England? And is there a piece of this history, the feast, the mythology, the Swan Knight, the ceremony that you want to know more about. I read every one.